let's start off with a word of prayer. Father, I thank you so much for the privilege that we have, Lord, to be part of church history. Lord, I thank you that we can study from men and women that have gone before us. Lord, I pray that we would continue to be faithful. Lord, that we would understand the doctrines of the faith, that we would communicate that to the next generation, Lord. I pray that you would use this church, you would keep this church. Lord, I pray that we would continue to be a light to the world. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so in this lesson, we're going to talk about Baptist distinctives, and we're going to try to answer the following question. Where did the Baptists come from? Where did Baptists come from? And there are several different theories about where Baptists come from. Maybe you've heard these before. Something that a lot of people think is that Baptists came from the Anabaptists. You know, it's kind of similar name, kind of got, Anabaptists are all about rebaptism, baptism of adults, so it seems very similar to Baptist. Another theory is the trail of blood, Baptist successionism, that Baptists really go all the way back to the beginning. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And the third theory is that the Baptists are a part of the Protestant Reformation. It's a continual part of this Reformation. And so we're going to talk about these three views today. And first, we're going to talk about the Anabaptists. We're talking about Anabaptists. So it's interesting. So Anabaptists get a really bad rap in the beginning of the Reformation. So Anabaptists, they have a couple very distinctive things about them that make them fairly unique. So what are some characteristics about Anabaptists? The first thing is primitivism. Primitivism. What is primitivism? So primitivism is an attempt to reconstruct the primitive church of the first century. It's an attempt to go all the way back to the book of Acts. It's actually a very negative view of church history. And it's a belief that the church, soon after the age of the apostles, fell into corruption, or after the time of Constantine, Emperor Constantine in the 3rd, 4th century. And so ever since then, basically you can throw all church history out the window. Okay, so this is a bit different from the Reformation. So the Protestant Reformation is an attempt to reform the church. It's a belief that the church did go wrong, and there was a lot of things that were very, very problematic, but it can be reformed. You don't have to start from zero. And primitivism says, no, all right, it's just so bad, let's clean the slate. So everything that happened for the past 1,700 years or 2,000 years, depending on how far back you want to go, let's just clear it all out and start over. That's what you get with primitivism. So it's an attempt to bring the book of Acts and say, okay, let's start here. Okay, start over again. It's like a restart to the church. Also, Anabaptists are known for pacifism. Now, this is interesting because Anabaptists were not always known for pacifism. Anabaptists in the 16th century, the century of the Reformation, were actually known as a little bit of a terrorist organization. That might surprise you. They were actually, some of the craziest groups were part of this Anabaptist movement. So the Anabaptist movement is very diverse. There's some different groups. But some of the craziest groups were connected to, I'll just give a couple examples. There were the Zwickau prophets. So these two prophets that came to Wittenberg, wanted to talk to Martin Luther, and they believed that they had direct revelation from God, and they were going to reestablish society. And they were not very popular in Wittenberg, so they went out and did something else. There's another group from the city of Munster. Now, the people of Munster, the Anabaptists in Munster, took over the city council, and they implemented kind of like a theocracy, where some that were kind of like their prophets were telling them how to live, and so they're trying to go all the way back to the Bible, scriptural things. And so they did some very strange things. So they liberated polygamy. They were very violent and militant if you did not accept the reforms that they wanted to do. And it was just very, very strange. A lot of weird things going on. And so actually it was a combined army of Roman Catholic and Protestant armies, princes that came in and took over the city of Munster and kind of wiped them away. And so because of that, the Anabaptist movement was kind of known as a terrorist organization a little bit. All right, so it's kind of strange. As a response to that, you have, like the guy showed you at the beginning of the slide, Menno Simons. Menno Simons comes along and he preaches that Anabaptism should be something that is completely anti-violence, anti-war. So you have this belief, this theology that evolves over time in the Anabaptist movement, a condemnation of war, participation in any armed forces. You can't be part of the army. You can't even have an army to defend yourself. So there's no idea of just war theory. There's no sense, even if someone invades your house, that you could defend yourself. There's none of that, no violence of any kind. And so that becomes a distinguishing mark of the Anabaptist movement. Another mark is anti-society. Anti-society. So what is this? This is an idea where they want to create communities separate from society at large. And this in part was a result of the persecution that many of these Anabaptist groups encountered. They would just separate themselves, and then eventually it became a kind of a theology of its own. Idea of, you want to separate yourself from the world, any sense of contamination, so there's separate communities over here, and then the world over there. Another idea is anti-tradition. Anti-tradition. This is a rejection of all that is part of church tradition, church history. So this, for a lot of Anabaptist movements, this includes things like musical instruments, church buildings, ordained ministers, things like that. They're just trying a rejection of all those things that aren't explicitly in the Bible. Also, they tend to be fairly anti-hierarchy in their worship style. It's a rejection of positions of leadership in the church or any sense of denominational structure. And this changes a little bit from group to group, all right? So now, I've shared this with you. So actually, we here, where we live in Indiana, we have some very interesting examples of Anabaptists. Who do you guys think that is? We have the Amish, right? You have the Amish, you have Mennonites. Mennonites are from Menno Simons. The Amish are a little bit more extreme. So this picture in the bottom left-hand corner here, this is actually a picture of Mennonites in Brazil. I thought that was interesting. Doesn't really fit a whole lot of the Brazilian ethos or anything, but that's fine. I guess that's the idea, right? Live separate from society. And so you have a lot of examples. So these are actually the real descendants of the Anabaptists. They are the continuation, the actual outflow of the Anabaptist community. And I noticed something that's very interesting. We talked about them being anti-tradition. But what are they kind of known for? They're very traditional, right? They're kind of stuck in a period of time, which is interesting. This happens often. When you reject tradition, what happens is you have to replace it with something. Human beings are traditioned creatures. We need the sense of culture, idea of history, things coming before us. That's a very natural part of the human experience. Culture is passing on, basically, tradition of things that have gone before you. And so when you reject all that, eventually you replace that with other things, all right? Now, you can probably tell, I do not think that the Baptists come from the Anabaptists, all right? So that's one theory. We could probably say, there are certain similarities. They emphasize believers' baptism at some point, but there are a lot of distinctions, a lot of things that would be very different from the Baptists, okay? So let's move on here. We'll talk about the second theory. The second theory is the theory of Baptist succession. And so there's this book here called The Trail of Blood, and the subtitle says, Followers of Christians Down Through the Centuries, or the History of Baptist Churches from the Time of Christ, their founder, to the present day. All right, so this is actually a very bold historical claim that's being made. Okay, so what is the theory of Baptist succession? In 1931, James M. Carroll wrote a book called The Trail of Blood, which teaches that Baptists come from a continuous line of churches that affirm believers' baptism going all the way back to the apostles. Okay, did you get that? So it's the idea that Baptists really go all the way back. Baptists are the church that Christ founded. And then there's all these groups. So this in the book, The Trail of Blood, there's this chart. And you have all these little red dots here. See those red dots? Those are different churches throughout church history that were never a part of, the Catholic Church, big C or little c. And they were often persecuted. So all these persecuted groups, so that's why it's called the Trail of Blood. All these persecuted groups, these minority groups throughout church history. And it's an interesting theory, and it's actually maybe very appealing. You think, wow, that sounds great. Baptist churches go all the way back. It is the church that Christ founded. Wow, that's really cool, right? But the problem is this theory doesn't really hold up to historical scrutiny. For the first point, several groups that are included in Carroll's lists of persecuted groups that were Baptists were actually not Baptists at all. Okay, so this includes the Montanists. Now, I think this is really fascinating. In Carroll's list, he includes the Montanists. So who are the Montanists? The Montanists were a 2nd and 3rd century heretical group that would be much more associated today with Pentecostalism, like extreme forms of Pentecostalism. So the idea of prophetic utterances, speaking in tongues. There was a main prophet, and then there was 2 other prophets, 2 lady prophets that would kind of follow him around. And these groups, the Montanists, kind of gathered this following around these very charismatic individuals, and they were preaching these things, that we should experience all these signs that were experienced in the book of Acts. It's interesting how in church history a lot of problems get recycled. Isn't that interesting? A lot of things you look back and you're like, wow, where did this come from? And you look back, you're like, oh, things don't just pop up out of nowhere. So the Montanists were like these very extreme Pentecostal groups, and they were not Baptistic really in any shape or form, okay? The only thing that Carroll maybe could bring out about them was that they were a persecuted minority. Eventually they were rejected and they were kind of cast out. A second group is the Cathars, and the Cathars is a very interesting group because they were not even Trinitarian. They denied the Trinity, all right? But Carroll had them in his group. Also, he had the Waldensians, and the Waldensians are more orthodox in their beliefs, but they would be much more in line with what we know today as Presbyterian. If you can read their confessions, they affirmed infant baptism and things like that. So they're just not Baptistic, okay? And so that's a big problem with this theory. Also, this theory is a way to deny any connection with Roman Catholicism or Protestantism. Okay, so this theory doesn't want anything to do with either of those things. For a lot of these Baptist groups that affirm the Trail of Blood, they view Protestantism almost as negatively as they view Roman Catholicism. And they don't want to be connected in any way to either group. So say our church goes all the way back to Christ, and we were never part of this main, things that branched off and things like that, all right? Now here's the problem. Here's the problem. A lot of times you look at church history, you look at things that happened, things that were believed, things that were taught, and it can cause us to be very uncomfortable. And church history does that to almost everyone. If you look at it, there are things that make you uncomfortable, right? But this is not the answer. You can't rewrite history. Right? And the problem is that Carroll's book is basically Baptist fan fiction. It kind of tries to come up with this answer to go around these uncomfortable parts of church history. But you can't do that. You have to accept history for what it is. Also, and this is, I think, the biggest problem, this view was not how the original Baptist viewed themselves. This is not how the original Baptist viewed themselves. So now we're going to look at Baptists and the Protestant Reformation. What is the connection between Baptists and the Reformation? So I have up here the first London Confession of Faith, London Baptist Confession of Faith, and I want you to notice something. All right, I'm going to put it a little bigger here, and we're going to read this together, and look what they thought. Okay, look how they thought about themselves. The Confession of Faith of those churches who are commonly, though falsely, called what? Anabaptists. They were like, the early Baptists were like, that's not us. That's not us. Presenting to the view of all that fear God to examine by the touchstone of the word of truth, as likewise for the taking off those aspersions which are frequently, both in pulpit and print, although unjustly, cast upon us. All right, so Baptists at the time, in the 17th century, when the Baptists came about, they were accused of being many things. They were linked with Anabaptists. And they were like, no, that's not who we are. That's not how we think of ourselves. So how do Baptists, the early Baptists, how did they think of themselves? And so here is another print of another confession. So this is from the General Baptist. So the previous confession I showed you is from the particular Baptist, so the more Calvinistic Baptist. So this is from the General Baptist, or less Calvinistic Baptist. And this is, I'll just read this to you. This is the beginning of their declaration of faith. It's called an Orthodox Creed. An Orthodox Creed, or a Protestant confession of faith, being an essay to unite and confirm all true Protestants in the fundamental articles of the Christian religion against the errors and heresies of Rome. All right, so do you think that the Baptists thought of themselves as connected to the Protestant Reformation in some way? Yeah, they did. They owned it. They put it in the title of their confession. They're like, we're in this Protestant stream. All right, so, and in this, it's interesting. You know, we talk about the Orthodox Creed here. It's actually a confession. But it's actually a very fascinating work. If you read early Baptist confessions and creeds, the Orthodox Creed is really interesting. I really like this confession because of the way it actually does what we did in our previous study. We talked about the Apostles' Creed, our connection to the Church Catholic, lowercase c, the Church Universal. In the Orthodox Creed, it says the following. It talks about all the canonical books and says all canonical books, all these books, which are given by the inspiration of God, are to be the rule of faith and life. In the very next paragraph, what did these Baptists say? The three creeds, the Nicene Creed, the Athanasian Creed, and the Apostles' Creed, as they are commonly called, ought thoroughly to be received and believed. Huh. That's interesting. Maybe you've heard the saying before, you know, I have no creed but the Bible. Right? Does that sound like a Baptist thing to say? Not to the early Baptists. They were like, yep, there were problems with church history. But you know, God was working. God was working. You accept complexity. So where did the Baptists come from? So if you actually trace out where the Baptists come from, it starts in the Protestant Reformation, and specifically the English Reformation, the Church of England, where Anglicanism. Now, Anglicanism tries to be kind of a middle way, the via media, as they like to call themselves. They're like the middle way between Roman Catholicism and more extreme versions of Protestantism. All right, so there was a lot of people within Anglicanism that were like, you know what, this hasn't reformed far enough, you know? I mean, it's good, you know, they corrected some things, but you need to keep going. And these people were called Puritans. Now, Puritans were people that were within the Church of England. They didn't separate themselves, or not initially, but they wanted to, again, purify the church, continue this process of reformation. eventually some of these Puritans really couldn't take it any longer, or eventually were kicked out because of their very staunch stance on different things. And so they formed separatist movements. A lot of times were called also Congregationalists. And from these Congregationalist movements came the Baptists in the early 1600s. So that's where the Baptists come from. They thought of themselves and they saw themselves as part of this reforming stream. The idea is that we're continuing this work of reformation. And so this is really, really important. Baptists don't see themselves as starting from scratch, just me and the Bible, it's a total rejection of church history. It's saying, let's continue this process of reforming. Let's keep going. Keep the project going. And so as part of that, Baptists came up with distinctives, things that were very typical or firm, that became synonymous with the Baptist movement. And some of these will be very familiar to you. You have things like biblical authority. Excuse me. This is something that Baptists totally accepted from the Protestant Reformation, the doctrine of sola scriptura, that the Bible is the only infallible rule of faith and practice. Right? There are other rules, right? There's the creeds. Even in our church here, we have the church constitution, right? There are other rules, but the Bible is the only infallible rule. And for this reason, the Bible is on top of everything. There is nothing within the church, there's no position, no book, no other book that can match the authority of the Scriptures, because the Scriptures are the inspired Word of God. And so that's what that means, biblical authority. The autonomy of the local church. We have the priesthood of the believer. 2 ordinances, believers' baptism and the Lord's Supper. We have individual soul liberty. We have regenerate church membership, and 2 offices, pastor and deacon, and separation of church and state. And so the idea what the Baptist movement was trying to do, and the Baptist contribution to church history, is the following things. Let me go back here. The following things. This is our contribution. This is what we're trying to bring to the table. So the idea is that there is individual responsibility before God for your soul. So you are responsible before God whether you will accept or reject the gospel of Jesus Christ. So that is the thing. That is the important thing. Individual responsibility before God. And this brings out things like credo baptism, believer's baptism. This is as opposed to infant baptism. Infant baptism is kind of the idea that, your faith is passed from the parents or the godparents to the child. Maybe if you've ever seen a Roman Catholic baptism, Roman Catholics, and a lot of churches like Anglicans will have things like this. Will have godparents that answer the questions for the baby. So the priest will ask things like, do you renounce the works of Satan? Do you believe in God the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit? And the godparents for the baby will say what? They'll say, yes. Okay, the idea is that this faith is being passed on to the infant. And Baptists come along and say, you know what? Every person is responsible before God to answer for himself, whether he will accept or reject the gospel. Which leads to credo baptism, believer's baptism. You are baptized upon affirmation of the gospel message. And this leads to a regenerate church. The idea is that because you only baptize people that are saved, that are regenerate, you preserve the purity of the church before God. And so this leads to congregational church government, the idea that the church is responsible, the local church is responsible before God for itself. Again, this is a result of this idea, the idea of individual responsibility before God, which leads to ecclesial church responsibility, local church responsibility before God. in matters of doctrine and who you're going to accept as the leadership of your church, who you accept into membership of the church. In a lot of other churches, especially ones that are much more hierarchical, especially ones that are much more like Roman Catholics or Anglicans, it's very passive. The lay people have very little influence on what goes on in their local church. And this also leads to freedom of religion, the responsibility of the church before local government. And so these are the contributions. And this is what I'm going to be talking about the next few weeks as the Lord permits, and elaborate these things as how they are played out within our Baptist world.